All right, everybody. I went ahead and shared the results for that poll. I appreciate you all joining us today. We're going to be talking about case management today. So, by definition, a case is a set of activities that are interrelated in some way, but the logic of the activity flow is not necessarily an orchestration and combination of steps and rules. So case management is really more about collaboration, more so than a process-driven workflow, and therefore allows more flexibility for people to add and remove steps, work together, and accomplish work that isn't ideal for traditional process automation or workflow. So now before we get started, and for those of you who may be new to Decisions, we are first and foremost a business process management software that helps non-technical people to easily automate and optimize business processes without the need to code. On this slide are some of our current customers in different sectors, to give you an idea of where Decisions fits. We're equal parts rules engine and workflow, so there's a lot of different problems we can solve across different industries. So unfortunately, here's my headshot, so you can match a name with the face. I have had the pleasure of meeting a lot of you on our webinars or over video calls in the past. But now I'm about to discuss some of our upcoming events. Before doing that, I will just mention my name is Tim Stahl. I'm the Director of Pre-Sales Engineering here at Decisions. We really welcome connections and questions, even on LinkedIn. So please feel free to add me there, and I'll be more than happy to connect with you and answer any questions you may have. So now our events are upcoming. So in April, so in this month, later in the month, we have our certification, our fundamental certification in Eastern Time Zone. The fundamentals will certify that you are competent to build simple applications using the 5 designers inside Decisions. There's a follow-up developer level certification available as well. This course will require the completion of quizzes and a final exam. And of course, if all requirements are met, attendees will walk away with the certification in hand. Next, later on in the month, the week after that, we have our associate certification, also in the Eastern Time Zone. This one will certify that you have the ability to build projects with both process-oriented data and non-process-oriented data using all primary designers of Decisions. This course has an emphasis on data management and flow utilization, though, and you must have passed your fundamental cert prior to the course start date. Now, moving on, in May, we have our training, so our beginner and intermediate level training. And one thing I want to point out is this is in Australian Eastern Standard Time. So we have training events all over the world in different time zones, and that is something to note. Our May 4th through 6th is going to be in Australian time. So for Decisions users that are new to the platform and have never built anything in the tool, this track will teach you how to build within the 5 designers inside Decisions and gives you a really great foundation on which to continue your Decisions path. Then later on in May, we have our last certification in line there, which is our professional one. Again, that is moving back to Eastern Time Zone. And this will certify the ability to build and understand all of the different data structures within Decisions. This includes their features, deep dives into their implications, as well as a much more advanced usage and flow design, including batch processing and complex rules. Now, just like the other certifications, this does have a prerequisite, and you had to have passed the associate cert prior to this course start date. So today, what we're going to go over, we're going to start with a quick introduction to cases versus workflows. And this really is set up to allow you to understand the basic differences between those 2 types within Decisions. We'll go over some case examples and even some use cases. Couldn't help it. And then finally, we'll go into a demonstration where I'll actually dive into the product and show you the different designers, how it works, and how you can actually use cases within your process. So starting off, what is a workflow? So a workflow, traditional business process. So what happens and who is involved is usually predetermined. It's something that your company does over and over, and something you want to do in a very efficient way. Workflow processes are structured and repeatable. The primary advantage is they're easy to understand and construct because the steps are defined so concretely. So why you might use a more flow-centric approach? If you have If you have complex routing, you can branch and merge for multiple activities. You have tasks that can produce additional tasks in routing based on data gathered in the workflow. You can use data to determine how many and what types of tasks are taking place. And of course, you can loop back to redo activities, and you even have the functionality to skip backwards and forwards. Now, the main thing to keep in mind when you're talking about a workflow, it's structured, it's repeatable, and it's a sequence that has a defined start and end point. You think about a purchase request, for example. A user could go in and request, maybe a new laptop, for example. And in that request, it's going to follow some very basic and consistent steps. Get information from the user, find out whether that purchase is approved, purchase that particular item, receive it, and then send it to the user. There isn't really ever going to be a time where you get to the end of a purchase request and you give the laptop to a user and you need to maybe send it back to looking up what particular item they want. The same thing with employee onboarding. You're going to have different employees in different departments, but the onboarding process is going to be very structured. The employee fills out some paperwork, they go through a process to get onboarded, they fill out maybe some tax documents, and then finally they're admitted into the company. So again, like it says at the bottom there, there may be optional actions and branches, but the primary sequence of activities is usually the same. Now, a case, on the other hand, as I mentioned earlier, is a collaboration more than a process-driven workflow. So these give you more flexibility for people to add and remove steps, work together, accomplish work that isn't ideal for a traditional process automation or workflow. There is not necessarily a defined path that the process takes. You can jump around. So if we look at the structure here, like claims management, throughout a claims management process, a user could submit a claim. And throughout that, there may be, times where someone needs to verify that the claim is valid. They need to do an assessment, a damage assessment maybe, and figure out, how much do they need to pay out. They make a decision on that, but maybe that decision is denied and needs further assessment. You can pass it back to that step. In case management, it really, the number of outcomes and the number of activities aren't as determined like it might be in a traditional business process that is based on a single flow. It also requires collaboration. You may add more and more people as you go, and some questions might arise that make you revisit some of your base assumptions. You might move back and forth. You may even discover an entirely new category of things that you need to investigate. The primary advantage is for workflows that do not progress in a serial or completely predictable fashion and may require users to select and coordinate activities. It's all about collaboration and the ability to move between processes, at your discretion. So if you were here at Decisions right now, and we were to draw out a case example on the use case on the whiteboard, it may look something like this. You've got two axes here, one that starts with, or one that's about how consistent a process is from, inconsistent to completely consistent. You also start with your data. Is it structured? Moving from unstructured data to structured data up at the top here. We've got some case examples here that range from, designing a logo to an IT incident. They fall in different quadrants of this matrix according to those two attributes, the consistency of the process and the structure of the data. Now, depending on how structured the data is and how consistent the process is, will determine if it's a case or workflow. So in Decisions, though, it's not an either or decision. You may need to use workflow and cases together. You can have a case that uses workflow to accomplish your tasks as necessary. So, again, if we look at this chart here, we'll see, there's really those two axes, and one is, how structured is the data? Is it all the same? When you're designing a logo, the data is not always going to be the same. It's going to be different for every logo you have because every customer is different. Now, if you look at a PO approval, that data is extremely structured. That's why it's towards the top of our list there. And because of that, that's follows more of a workflow type arrangement. Now how consistent is the process is the other side. And hiring, if we look at our client onboarding, hiring a sales clerk, very consistent, rinse and repeat. You put out a job opportunity, someone applies to it, you interview them, you hire them or you don't. Hiring a CEO, a lot different. There's all sorts of different factors you take in. Are you using a search committee? Are you using an outside source to find these particular candidates? And during that hiring process, there's just a lot of back and forth. There could be negotiations. There could be additional pieces of information you need to gather that you wouldn't normally do for an entry level employee. Even a medical diagnosis. When you go to the doctor and you say you're not feeling well, there are some structured data, your medical record, for example, who you are and, the information about you. But there's a lot of unstructured data. What is actually, your description of what's wrong? The doctor might do different things depending on what you present with. It has a much, much less consistent process. PO approvals, again, I've mentioned that, it has much more structured data. What is the item I'm purchasing? How much is it? How many do I need? And where am I getting it from? The process is very consistent, defined start, defined ending. So, one of the other things to consider too is the less structured the data, the more of an expert that person is who's working the task. Because if you look at an unstructured piece of data and an unstructured or a very, very consistent process, that's something that's easily trainable, easy to relate to for most people, and doesn't require a lot of again, a lot of training to move that through. Now, if you move into something like a medical diagnosis, for example, that's going to require a much more specialized person who can intuit what needs to be done next and can use the various parts of the case and the various states of the case to move that through the process. Now, one thing to keep in mind throughout this whole thing is don't be intimidated if the distinction between cases and workflow is difficult, because while the difference is important, it can also be very, very subtle. Another thing with this to think about is, let's say you have the same problem, but at a different magnitude. One might be handled with a case, one might be handled in a workflow. For example, processing a purchase for a company laptop, copier, paper, it's the same repeatable standard process that the engine can handle versus building or purchasing software like Decisions. You're going to go into a cycle where you could loop from locating a product, reviewing it, getting a proof of concept, and then iterating back to locating a product. Maybe this next product doesn't require a proof of concept. You can skip right over that, go right to funding. In this manner, the process isn't as well structured as many procedures along the way affect how the case progresses. So really, the extremes and trends tend to appear. Something that is less structured and more inconsistent is likely a good candidate for a case. Something that is highly replicable and structured is going to be a workflow. However, again, I've mentioned it before and I'll mention it again, you can leverage workflow in a case and have steps that are followed at defined stages in a case. For instance, perhaps there's an IT ticketing app built using a case, but during the root cause analysis, there's a repeatable process like assign a worker and then send that worker an email with the details and then send the submitter an email update. So again, you can really start to see how you can use the case as your base of the process and then build on that with actions, with triggers, with workflow that can automate parts of the process as it moves through. So what does this look like in Decisions? So this right here, this is the case editor within Decisions. And this is a typical case, and I used flow in quotation marks there. But you can see we have across the top our color boxes there that have numbers in them and states. And those are the different states that a person can go through, or that this case can go through from quote unquote start to quote unquote end. In this case, we have 5 from submitted to under review, schedule review, pending decision, and closed. And at each one of those different spots, you're going to see activities under that particular state. And what that is if you see the ones with the little person on it, the little person icon, like this one under submitted that says upload documents, for example, that is a user action. So when it moves into that submitted status, the user is presented with the option of uploading documents. So now those actions are actually workflows and decisions. So you can see where it can get complicated. So because the case has a submitted state, the action is available for the user to upload documents. Now, when we move from submitted to under review, you'll notice we have 3 actions. Send an email. We have our upload documents again. That's valid in a couple of our different states. We can move it right to closed. So maybe it goes right from under review to closed. We just completely get out of that process. And this last one here, you'll notice has this little, arrow on it, and that's trigger flow. And what that does is as soon as that case hits that state, it's going to trigger that flow to run. It's a review application process. And in this case, it's assigning a task to a user who then has to make a decision on whether to move that forward or not. Now, when we move it into schedule interview, you can see we have that trigger that runs that schedules that interview immediately. But if you moved it back from schedule interview to under review, it's going to assign that task again and present them with these 3 activities. So it's to all the actions and all the workflow and all the automation is tied to the states. So everything you can do in this case, you look at the different states you can have and define those actions or triggers based on what's available for that particular state. So again, at the bottom, we can see you start by defining them. You can have rule or state-driven processes. You have your user actions, and then you finally come out to define your triggers there. So that was a whole lot of talking about cases. Let's go ahead and I'll stop that part, and we'll dive into the product and take a look at what case management looks like within decisions. We'll go ahead and get this to go at a full screen, and we'll pop into the back of the product here. So now what you're seeing here, for those of you who are not current customers, this is the back end of Decisions or the Decisions Studio. You'll notice everything I'm doing today is within my web browser, and that's because our platform is delivered in a 100% web delivered format. So whether you're building this particular case or application or workflow, or using that particular case or application or workflow, it's all done through your web browser. Now, what we have here is a loan application process for various types of loans. And this is a process that was created for our Agile company here. And we can see on this dashboard, we have various different loans that have been submitted or applications that have been submitted. We have some assets that are tied to them. So depending on what I select, we can see that our assets change because that's what's tied to these. And then on the right-hand side here, we have our activity panel. And this activity panel is showing the state of the case as it moved through process. We can see the various statuses that it went through. We can see when it went through those states, and we can see any comments that have been assigned, like this task was claimed from the queue. Then we had an assignment. It was assigned to a user. How long did they spend in that interaction? And how long did they even have maybe that approval form open? All of that is automatically tracked. And if you're familiar with workflow, this is very, very familiar to you. You have states, you have tasks, you have assignments, and then you have folks who complete them. Now, to kick this process off, we're going to go ahead and start by submitting a new loan application. Now, this process, we'll go ahead and walk it through from start to about the middle of it. And then I'll dive into the back end and show you how that was configured. And then we'll make a quick change to it. And you'll see how easy it is to add more to your process. So I'll go ahead and expand my tree here. And I'm going to go ahead and click on my Submit Loan application. Now, when I do that, we're presented with a form. So this is where a user would come in and start filling out these particular fields with all of their information. So we'll give them their address. We'll come down and pop in a date of birth. And let's see, their employer, maybe they work here at Decisions. And then finally, we're going to enter in the rest of this information. Now, as we put this in, what this system is doing is actually going through and saying, based on all of the details that I'm putting in here, it's going to say what risk is associated with this user's application. So we can say we'll put in our basic vehicles. Maybe we have a Ford F-150. And then we'll actually give it maybe a bank account here with a bunch of money in it, so we can make sure that we actually get this loan here. So now all of this data, when I hit submit, is going to go through a rule set again that's going to calculate out the particular risk associated with this loan, and then it's going to determine whether this loan is automatically approved or denied, and then we go through the rest of the case process. Go ahead and we'll say maybe it's a 20-year fixed rate conventional loan. So I'll go ahead and click submit. We've submitted the case. We can see our end form here. It says our application's been submitted. And then finally, if we come back to our dashboard here, we'll see that new one in process here. We can see it calculated out a really low risk score for us, and it's currently sitting in pending review. If I was to come over here, because in all reports and decisions are actionable, if I was to come over to my report here and right click on this particular item, based on the state it's in, which is pending review, I'm going to get the actions that are associated with that state. So right clicking, we can see I get a claim task action. So I'll go and click on that. And you can see not a whole lot changed here, but that action has actually been taken. And we can see that the task has been claimed from the queue by me. And now it's moved because of that into the underwriting stage. So again, if I were to come over to my report and right click, I'm going to get different actions that are available. So I'll go ahead and click on our review loan application, and we'll see that that gives us another form. It's showing us what we saw earlier, so what the user entered. We can make any review possible and then make a determination on what we'd like to do with this. If we approve it, we can hit approve, and that'll change the state of the case as well. We can see that our order was created and everything at this point has been done. We can go ahead, and the last thing we need to do is close on the loan, and that'll run it through the process to finish everything out. And now we can see that this is completely closed and everything is done. So that was a very, very typical case. User submitted some information, we filled out some details, and then finally decided whether we were going to approve or deny this. Now, that's all well and good, but let's go ahead and look at the back end here and see how this was created using the case management system. So I'm going to dive into my folders here, and we'll see in here, I have some, we have our flows and we have some rules and things like that, but the really interesting thing here is the case itself. So if I dive into my case details here, we'll see that we're presented with something very similar that you saw earlier on the slides, which are these various states across the top. So we can see started and pending review, underwriting. We didn't go through denied because it wasn't a denied, the loan wasn't denied. We can see approved and then finally closed. So now what we could do here is under each one of these, there were different activities that happened. That risk assessment ran because I submitted a new case. It was triggered. Under our pending review, we can see there's a user action there called claim task. Again, under underwriting, we can see the application had to be assigned. Now, at each one of these steps, if we wanted to see what was in these, we could simply click on our claim task. It's going to open up the associated workflow, and we can see that there's a real simple workflow here. Takes in a case, adds the comment, sets the state, and then refreshes our dashboard. Very, very simple process. Now, if we were to come over to our risk assessment, for instance, we could look at that, and this trigger looks, again, just like a normal decisions workflow. We can pass things in, we run our risk calculation, we add a comment to it, and then depending on that risk score, we either set it to pending review or denied. So you can see the things that are really driving what's available to the user are the states that the workflow moves through. And any information that you have available to you and all of the steps in the toolbox can be used to help you make those determinations automatically. So while there is human interaction and human in the loop, we still have automation behind the scenes that's doing some of the work for us. If we wanted to come into our risk assessment, we can even see this is a rule set. We're passing in the details of the application. We're running it through some rules. Do they have large liabilities, for instance? We could look at that, and depending on whether they have large liabilities or not, we're outputting a score. And that score is what's being used to calculate that risk assessment. And then finally, down in our matrix rule here, we can see, what type of loan they were looking for, what the length of the loan was. We're outputting a score here as well. But then that score is what's being used to either automatically approve or deny that particular loan. So, okay, again, you're probably thinking, well, that's all well and good. So what do I do now if I need to add something to this process? Well, again, the good thing about the particular case management system we offer is it's very simple to come in here and say, well, let's add something to this process. Maybe an underwriting here. We want a way to, send it back to pending review state, for instance. Well, what I could do here is I could come under my underwriting tab. I could add an activity, and we'll add a user action. Now we're going to call this return for review. Go ahead and click on create. That creates that action and drops us right into the flow designer. Now, for those of you not familiar, this is our standard what you see is what you get flow designer. We have our canvas here in the middle with our start and our end step. And we also have our steps toolbox here on the left that's loaded with over 3,500 custom steps that you can drag and drop out on the canvas to do the various things you need to do for your process. So in our case, what I'm going to do is, we want to just do something simple, which is just going to set this back to a pending review. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to grab a set entity state step. So we'll go ahead and grab that. And it helps if I type the right thing in. And once we get that, go ahead and grab that step out here, connect it up. We simply have to tell it, okay, which entity are we setting? So which case are we going to change? Well, the good thing is we can go ahead and select that and it gets passed into the workflow. And this is all has to do with how case management works. So we can tell it it's that one. And that new state is going to be pending review. So now just like that, we have a step. It's going to do that particular process. We'll go ahead and I think the last thing we'll do is let's go ahead and refresh our dashboard once we've done this. So that's another step here that I'll pull out. We'll go ahead and pop that down. And it's going to ask us which dashboard to update. And on my other screen, I have that information already ready to go. So now once that's connected up, we can go ahead and see that this is ready to go. It's a valid workflow. And we can go ahead and exit out of this and save. So now again, under underwriting, we can see we have our return for review user action here. And I can actually go back to the cases that were submitted earlier. So we'll go back to our dashboard here. And I could look at these various different cases that are in process. So for that action to show, it has to be in that underwriting state. So if I look through these, I can see it appears I may only have one here in underwriting state. But if I right click on this, we'll see return for review is now an action that's available for selection. I can simply come up here, click on return for review. We'll see that that's been done. And if I refresh my dashboard here, I can see that now that's been returned to pending review. I could right click it again and I can see that we get our claim task and the process is moving back through the system. So just like that, we can go from a process that had a kind of defined state to it, but we can easily add in other parts to the process. We can add in other actions and even other triggers. If we needed to go in and maybe, now we just decided we needed to send an email, well, we could add a trigger that every time that it hits this particular state, it sends out that particular email. So again, that's a very high-level look at cases within the Decisions platform. I'll go ahead and take a quick pause, see if there are any questions that came out of our attendees here. Take just a brief moment here to see if anyone has any questions. Please feel free to put those into our chat. Okay, so I did just receive one here. So we have one about the design and how the case itself can be customized. So the lines with the different lines within the designer. And what I'll do is we're actually going to take that offline and I'll email you directly and we'll get that answer to you. We had another question come up. It says at runtime, how much of the logic that you showed us runs at the browser and how much is server-based? So in the case of this is all server-based. Now, the designers, there's some logic that is in the browser, but in the case of the actual case processes running, displaying the dashboards, all that is all rendered server-side and then passed to the browser. Well, seeing that we had no more questions there, I'm going to go ahead and pop in a, let's see, stop those results. And we're going to go ahead and launch this last poll. Again, I appreciate your time today and coming to see our presentation on case management. I hope you leave with a little bit better understanding of how that works. Please feel free to answer that poll, and I'll give just a couple seconds for that. But I appreciate everybody's time and have a great day.